Welcome back, everybody. Let's talk about Malazan. And I've found someone today to talk to me about Malazan, and that is Niflrog, the master of text walls. Welcome.
How are you doing, Raf?
I'm doing fine. What about you?
It's okay here. It's weather is a bit weird, but overall fine. Doing fine.
Yeah. Well, it's windy, and for the Jaghuts like you and probably me, it's going to get warmer, which is always sad.
Yeah.
All right. I figured like today we want to talk a bit about Malazan read as history and historiography and how we can apply those things to understand the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And for that, I brought myself a beer,
Uh, so
which
did I,
is
actually.
wonderful. So I guess you want to say what kind of beer you brought, what kind of beer it is?
Yeah, this is an Alsatian beer.
Ah, okay,
Actually, it's some gluten-free Alsatian beer,
nice.
and that's it.
Cool. Yeah, I got an unfiltered from Franconia because, yeah, I do actually like their dark one even more, but they didn't have it at the shop today. So I figured let's go with the unfiltered one.
Yeah, the French don't do a lot of dark beers, so
No,
it's fine.
the dark beers are more like a Eastern thing, like in Czech Republic and Poland and like Eastern parts of Germany, you get more of the darker beers.
The thing is that I actually cheated because they had a Guinness, so I got a 4 pack of Guinness. So I
Very
have a
good.
backup.
Very good. All right, then. Cheers. Bam. Cheers.
Mm,
That's
that's
good.
fine. Mm.
Wonderful. All right. So now that we've established that, let's start about the whole idea of Malazan as history. It's like I remember when I did like my very first video, I said like that for me, it's when we did that synopsis kind of challenge that Iskar Jarak put out. And I said like it reminds me a lot about history, like historiography, and I compared it to Edward Gibbon. And then some people were like, "Oh, that makes a lot of sense." And so for me, as someone who studied history, this was a good like first access point. But you obviously come from a completely different background. Have you? When did you start thinking of it as more history than or historiography than of like just a novel or whatever?
Actually, the thing is that I finished the series,
Mm-hmm.
and those last chapters of the Crippled God are. I like to describe that as they give you this retroactive interpretation of everything.
Yeah, that's true.
So
Of
so you
course.
you're reading all this bits of information. You don't have a context for them.
Mm-hmm.
So you leave them there like in a vacuum until Erikson delivers that tiny line that transforms all the information you have so far.
Yeah.
And so when I see those last lines, I will write a book, and none other shall be needed. In this, my book of the following, and then I was like,
Yeah.
so wait, because the thing is that Malazan has a format, the book of the following in particular, but it also applies to the novels of the Malazan Empire that I'm reading now.
Yeah.
The structure is very suggestive.
Yeah.
Now, the average fantasy book doesn't have that, like the structure that allows that interpretation as reading a text of history.
Yeah, that's
So,
true.
so,
Some
so
do, but very few do, I guess.
yeah, for instance, take Lord of the Rings, take what I was reading before Malazan, which was either Song of Ice and Fire or The Sundering by Jacqueline Carey.
Okay.
That's a duology.
Yeah.
They, they read more traditionally.
Hmm.
But in Malazan, you have this structure that I think Erikson has mentioned. He copied from Dune, where
Yeah.
it's like in Dune that you have in universe um, quotes that introduce a chapter.
You do have that in Dune. You have it like a few other things before that, but the idea of having like a chapter epigraph with a source is like very like it's very typical for Dune. I always put up is it The Scarlet Citadel by Robert E. Howard, like one of the early Conan stories, and that has this quote that also is the opening lines of the Conan, the original or Schwarzenegger movie, this "Know, O Prince, that between the time of when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Ares," and so forth. And that is then like put in there, and as a source is given as the Nemedian Chronicles. And that's how he starts that story. So I always put that one up there as well with Dune, as like having an in-universe text as an introduction to a chapter, sort of.
And yeah, and well, I didn't know because I haven't read Robert E. Howard yet. But that's what I find interesting. I mean, that can be taken as a very basic metafictional component.
True.
Because you're already saying that, well, in this fictional universe, there is such a thing as the study of history, because you have a chronicles that you're quoting in universe.
True.
So it suggests a softer form of self-awareness of the text.
That's true. Like I would say, like, while Lord of the Rings definitely is less of a history thing, obviously the Silmarillion reads like history.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people always go out and like, oh, the Silmarillion, it's literally the Bible of Tolkien's world. And I'm like, you're right there, but mostly that's because a lot of like the Old Testament is also just historiography, and you can read you can read a lot of the Old Testament as history. That's because that's what it is, your kings and stuff like that, with fantasy elements, because you have the Witch of Endor summoning the ghost of Samuel, and I'm like, hell yeah, that's fantasy right there.
Yeah, and the thing is that with the Silmarillion, I mean, I love the Silmarillion. I really like it.
Yeah.
But I like to be a bit critical of it, and I tend to say that the Silmarillion is nothing but Noldor propaganda.
It definitely is. Well, most of it is Noldor propaganda.
Yeah, of course. But I find that funny, and people get really. I mean, the more hardcore Tolkien fans, some of them get really mad at that interpretation. But well, before we continue, I would like to highlight that the duology I mentioned by Jaghut and Carey, the Sundering.
Yeah.
It can be seen as a deconstruction of both the Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
It's kind of a mix. It's basically the story of the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, but from the perspective of Melkor or Sauron. It depends how you mix it.
Okay.
And it's interesting to think about it in those terms. It's like, because it's one of the things I like the most about how Malazan handles the great battle between good and evil. Yes, you can say that the bad guys are bad because it's an axiom of that universe, because they are. But I always found more interesting to give some kind of context to where does evil come from? What does it mean that he's the bad guy? In the Silmarillion, Melkor is evil because it isn't very clear, actually.
Well, I would say, like, the way I read it in the Silmarillion is Melkor is evil in the same way that Lucifer is evil in Paradise Lost. It's the sin of pride, basically. He tries to do more, because that's basically what you have in the beginning of the Silmarillion with when they are still like the Ainur are singing, and he's trying to invent his own kind of things. And so I would say it's more like the sin of pride there, that the same as Lucifer in Paradise Lost, just that we are slightly more sympathetic to Lucifer in Paradise Lost than we are to Melkor. The interesting question, though, is like, why does Aule get away with creating dwarfs, and Melkor is kicked out for singing his own melody.
That's a good one. But what I would like to argue is that I immediately wouldn't say empathy, but I didn't judge Melkor that harshly because the way I saw that is that he wanted to be creative.
Yeah.
He wanted to express his creativity. And then we go back to that old argument of okay, so Eru Ilúvatar the One is a cosmic dictator that doesn't allow anyone to have their own creativity.
Of course.
So for me, it didn't work. I didn't saw Melkor as such a bad guy.
No, of course not.
Of course, he later does a lot of terrible things, but at that point, it's already a war between the powers of the world.
Yeah, that's true.
And well, going back to the subject.
Yeah, right. Let's go back to Malazan for a moment.
Unlike the Silmarillion, where at no point it is suggested that the story is being, let's say, embellished.
Mm-hmm.
After you finish The Crippled God and you realize that this book you have been reading at the metafictional level is actually the work of Kamenson, you do see it because he's talking about honoring the fallen. It's kind of a tribute.
Yeah.
So then you start realizing that you can interpret all this as a history book written by the crippled god, well, the former crippled god, and then all these epigraphs take a new meaning. At least for me, the way I interpret that is that these are sources that either the Kamenson or the people he talks with to write down this text have used as sources.
That's true. Like, there's like two things there that just popped into my mind. So, like, I still think that you can read the Silmarillion as a type of historiography if you want to. And I'll get back to that in a second, because first, I think we need to look for a second. Like, I usually say historiography instead of history there, because I feel so my definition usually is like history is like shit happening, and historiography is when we write and try to make sense of the shit that happens. So written down history books that we buy are usually historiography, because just written down facts are not very interesting as stories, not very interesting to read. It's just like, and a lot of those facts are, when we actually do history as a science, there's very few facts that we can, like actually pin down really well, especially in like earlier periods of history. It's like, yes, there's very few things we can actually really write down as facts. So historiography is basically taking the things that we can know and arranging them in a type of narrative to actually answer questions of why did shit happen. And that's, I feel, important, and that it took a long time for historians to realize that means that written history, the kind of written history that we read, is basically a form of literature. And you can use tools that you learn in literary analysis and in literary studies. You can use those to read historical, like historiography texts, like your big historians, your like Herodotus, your Thucydides, your Gibbon, what have you. You can read them as literature, because all of them have a type of narrative, because they try to answer questions of why did this happen that go beyond, well, yeah, this guy Caesar died because he got stabbed. You want to know what led up to that. That automatically leads to a narrative.
And actually, that's a criticism I heard a lot lately in the last 5-10 years. It's the fact that when you read these history texts, it's always mentioned that there's always a perspective involved. When I was growing up, the history was usually framed. When I say history, I mean history texts, no
Yeah, of
history
course.
in the sense you say.
Mhm.
But these
Yeah.
historiographies are actually framed in terms of, say, the leader of a country.
Mhm.
And I remember phrases on encyclopedias and
Yeah.
on textbooks. Napoleon invaded this country because this and this and this happened. Well, it was not Napoleon that invaded that country. It's
Well, to be fair, he
obviously a
was
much more
usually in the front lines. Like he was usually actually physically doing it with his people.
Of course, he was doing it, but what's interesting to us is not that a single man named Napoleon did this.
Yeah.
It's these groups that he controlled, these
Hmm.
military groups that he controlled,
Yeah.
fueled by this nation that he had some political power over. But of course, that framing of history is reductive because it tells you nothing of the political interactions
Yeah.
in the French, let's say, in the French Empire at that moment, and it's
Yeah.
never that simple. But that characterization, Napoleon invaded
Hmm.
this and
Yeah.
did that because he felt this and that. Well, do you know how difficult it is to guess what someone is feeling? I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes even I myself don't know what I'm feeling about one
Of
thing
course
or
not.
another. Imagine
Yeah.
someone 50 years later, Niflrog thought felt like this, and so he chose to. It's fiction. At one level, it is a fiction.
Yeah. Like as I said, it took a long time for people to actually spell that out. I think like maybe not the first one, but the one that you like the text that kind of made it popular, at least in like more Anglo-Saxon Western kind of circles, is like Hayden White's Meta History, which is from the 1970s, I think, like maybe 79 even. Like when we talk about history and historical sciences, that's like basically yesterday. And that's he wrote that book Meta History. It's about like yeah, where he applies literary science to some classic historical texts and looks at that you yeah and shows up that they have like different modes that you can find in literature as well. And then people realize that, oh my god, he's right, we can. And then and so
That's
so
one I like to read. I didn't know about that, but
yeah, I mean,
I
you
will look
already
it up.
like metafiction, so you probably also like meta history, I guess.
Yeah,
So
and
it's definitely an interesting one to read. But my point was to look at the fact that once we realize that historiography or long text about longer like historical processes are a form of narrative, and we can use literary science techniques to look at them and analyze them, then you can take the other way around and say, hey, I write a fictional text, a narrative in a way. Now, obviously using the word narrative wrong here, but you can take that one and then write historiography as a fictional text over a fictional world by going the other way in that, like, once you establish the connection between literature and like
yeah,
fiction or narrative and historiography, once you establish it, you can do it both ways. And what Stephen Erikson does with the Malazan Book of the Fallen explicitly is basically doing that. He's going the other way around. It's like, yeah, I can write, or you can read it as historiography and as a historical, like as yeah, as historiography of a story that is basically answering the question, not basically answering the question, but one question would be like, what happens, and that's why I used Gibbon in the example, is like because he wrote obviously the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And it's like, what's the decline and fall of the Malazan Empire? Because during at least the Malazan Book of the Fallen, the Malazan Empire is going downhill from the parts that we actually see. I mean, you would
yeah.
need to read more of the novels of the Malazan Empire to actually know what's going on in the Malazan Empire, because most of the time with the Malazan Book of the Fallen, we're outside the empire or on its fringes. But yeah, so you
That's
can read it that way in a way, and that can then help you to understand or look at specific aspects of why the things are constructed that way with the tools that you maybe know from reading historiography or reading history in a way.
and and actually the thing is that I like the interpretation that I prefer right now,
Mm-hmm.
which is this one. it's not just for the Book of the Fallen, because the novels of the Malazan Empire fit very, very nicely into all this.
Yeah.
I call it the many canon framework.
Hmm.
You have two canons: the canon of Kamensot in the Book of the Fallen,
Yes.
and a canon about an unknown author that is writing the novels of the Empire.
True.
And if you take this framework into account, of course, things won't match nicely because they're different people with different interests studying different things. That's one of the
Yeah.
big discussions that we had when Iskarjarak put forward the challenge to summarize the series.
Yeah.
The Malazan Book of the Fallen is not about the Malazan Empire.
No.
The Malazan troops play a preponderant role, but it's not about the Malazan Empire. And like you said, that is precisely why we are always on the fringe of the Empire for the most part.
Yeah.
We don't follow the story of the Empire itself. In
No.
fact, the most important events about, let's say, Malazan succession, they're discussed in the novels of the Empire.
Exactly.
We don't see the coup d'état from Lassine to Kelanvet in the Book of the Fallen. It's in Night of Knives.
Exactly.
We don't see the coup that Malik Rel gives to Lassine in the Book of the Fallen. In fact, people get so frustrated because they are okay, so they just casually mention that Lassine is no longer empress. What happened? Like,
Do
I
they
think it's
actually
on
do they actually
Halo.
mention that in the Malazan Book of the Fallen? I've missed that.
They do, but it's so casual. It's like, oh, by the way, that woman, that blue woman, she's no longer the empress. What?
Yeah.
And then at some other part, they say the ascension of the Gistal priest, Malik Rel. But that's at the very end. And it's not that specific. They mention
Yeah.
ascension. If you have read about history texts,
Yeah.
ascension is usually reserved to a new emperor or king.
Yeah.
So you connect the dots, but they don't say explicitly.
No,
So now the emperor.
it's Malik Rel's.
Yeah, it's you find that out. It's in Return of the Crimson Guard and Stone Wielder.
Yeah, right. It's Stonewielder. I think it's. I've read the novels once, and at this point, a lot of this like stuff has blurred into this like huge like Malazan
Continuum.
continuum. Like, where did that actually happen, and who actually said that, and who in which book is that actually? And I'm like,
I have that problem all the time.
yeah, it's like,
especially since I try to engage all that I can with people reading the books, and people sometimes ask questions to get a bit of context or to check if they missed something important.
Yeah.
And it becomes really hard to remember. There was a guy making a question about Toll the Hounds, and I was like, he's on chapter 17 of Toll the Hounds. I don't remember when they mentioned the piece of information that would allow him to deduce this. How do I handle that? It gets tricky.
All right. So quick back before I forget to talk about that. So why I feel so I read like a while ago an essay by an Italian historian it's like 1960s essay. I forget his first name because my Italian is very bad, and like his surname is Momigliano in my best German accent, and he wrote like he's one of the really big historians of like the 20th century, and he wrote a small essay that I read like years ago at university, and it's about comparing Jewish, Persian, and Greek historiography and what the differences are and what made the Greek model of historiography the kind of model that was so successful afterwards in a way. Like, because when you look at how like Roman history took like its cues from the Greek historiography, and then like through the Renaissance, we kind of picked up that kind of idea of historiography as well, and so forth. And his like point was that Jewish historiography is kind of the Old Testament in a way, at least for like old Jewish. We're talking ancient history here, and not talking contemporary history. because he used to be a historian of like mostly ancient history. And the point is that he looked at how history and historiography were practiced in those different cultures at the time, which is, 5th century BCE kind of, or thereabouts, Jewish history and Greek history. And his argument is that the history that is written down from in the Old Testament, basically, if you read it, at least like the stuff after the Pentateuch, if you read that kind of stuff as history, as you should, because it's basically historiography, maybe except the Book of Job, which is lifted from Sumerian or like at least other Mesopotamian traditions. But what you do there, it is priestly sanctioned. This is because it is like turned into a holy book. It is the absolute truth. It's a very monolithic tradition of writing history. Whereas when you look at the Greek tradition, I'm going to leave out the Persian one for what I'm trying to say here. The Greek tradition is already, because of the way historiography being something of just like a secular science or like secular art at the time, there's different versions of the truth in Greek historiography. They argue with each other. The historians they contradict each other. There's different perspectives and views on it, and you don't have that in that Jewish Old Testament tradition, because what is written down there is priestly sanctioned, the absolute truth. It's the word of God. This is how things happened. And my argument was that you could read the Silmarillion as historiography, but in that religious mode, because which would fit nicely with your like Noldor propaganda, because that's a monolithic tradition right there with all these like religious overtones, which fits nicely with that idea of like people saying the Silmarillion is the Bible of Middle Earth, because yes, that's basically, this is the ultimate version there. Now, obviously, we know that those versions were like built on, because we have all of Tolkien's notes and stuff like that. But the finished book basically is exactly that. It's monolithic truth. And with the Malazan world, we don't have that. We have in the Malazan universe, we have these a more like Greek style, Greco-Roman, and then contemporary style of writing history, because there's no claim to this being the ultimate final truth. Not even Kamensav makes that claim with the Malazan Book of the Fallen, right? It's just like one version, and we can argue about it.
Yeah, and well, there are two things you mentioned that I would like to quickly cover.
All right.
One is the subject of let's say fiction. When we start talking about fiction in the context of historiography.
Yeah.
The term narrative, used in a more colloquial form lately, has gotten a lot of criticism too. Yeah. People are often put down, "No, that's just your narrative." And I would like to mention the work of, I don't know if he came up with this characterization, but he is the one from which I read it. It's Yuval Noah Harari, which is a historian. He wrote Sapiens
Sapiens and like a new one,
Yeah, 21 Lessons for the 21st century.
Yeah.
And what he argues is that when you analyze humans from an historical perspective, from the perspective of a historian, what is it that makes humans different from other animals? His argument is that we are capable of cooperating flexibly and in large numbers. In the animal kingdom, you find species that can cooperate in large numbers but not flexibly, like ants.
Yeah.
And others that can cooperate very flexibly with just small numbers, like or other primates. And what he argues is that we humans can do that exclusively because of fictions, because of narratives.
Yeah.
Narratives like money, national identity.
Yeah.
He even argues that humanism itself, the idea of liberal humanism, is a fiction or a narrative, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I think that's that's a very that's a perspective that is, I don't like to
Yeah.
frame it as in it being right or wrong, but it's useful because it allows you to interpret things differently, and I like the way in which that allows you to interpret everything.
Yeah, I do get that. And like, I feel, there's like been always this trend of like, ever since Aristotle started with this, like, let's define the human, let's define humans as, the Homo logos and so forth.
Yeah.
And yes, but one of the aspects that we got like relatively late, like the 1940s, 50s, which is one that I find personally very interesting, is the Homo ludens, which is like when someone started to actually look at the fact that humans do play, and playing in a very broad sense, like play acting and all kinds of things around that, not just like playing games, through their entire life. And that's like a defining thing of humanity, is that we, even as adults, we go and sit down and play a game, which like most other animals don't really do. Now, I'm not going to go into the argument what about dogs and stuff like that, but the idea of playing and putting stories in play is a very human thing. And the idea of actually narrative is, I feel like, very, very, very like human in general. It's like we do that ourselves, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like we try to make sense of our universe. At least I do, and usually that's by putting like your personal experience into some kind of narrative that connects one event to the next in a way
But
that makes sense. And that's yeah.
absolutely, that's how it is. And that brings me actually to the second point that I wanted to highlight, that I think is particularly interesting in the context of Malazan.
Yeah.
I'm interested in philosophy of science.
Very
So
good.
as a fan of philosophy of science, I
Yeah.
read the structures of scientific revolutions. Now, I'm aware that that work has had a lot of criticism, that's not the most recent iteration of that discussion, of that debate between Kuhn and Popper, which are, I think, the main two parts. But I still think that there are interesting points made in that book. And it's not just that there are very few events that we can call to be facts. It's that the framework, the theoretical framework that you have, allows you to frame something as a fact, or it doesn't. In terms of science, if your theoretical framework does not include atoms, when you design an experiment, you're getting a measurement, but you cannot interpret that like we can now, that we do think of atoms as something.
Yeah.
So there is this connection between your theoretical framework and data.
Yeah.
A particular theoretical framework will make it impossible for you to make a discovery because you don't even think about experiments in those terms.
That's
so it's
true.
not that clear. It's not that clear cut. Like, no, this is a fact. Well, it is a fact within the theoretical framework that you now have. But forget about that framework.
Yeah.
That fact, that experiment, it doesn't make the same sense. So it gets a lot more tricky. And that's, incidentally, that's something that we've discussed. And I don't remember which video. Is the fact that you have events that you want to call objective.
Yeah.
But there's always a perspective involved.
Yeah, true.
There is always a component of even the most I know this sounds a bit postmodernist, but it is what it is. even the most let's say obvious historical fact. I'm using a parallel between the historical fact and, let's say, the result of an experiment in natural sciences. Even if you have this fact that is completely obvious, there's always a perspective that distorts how you can interpret that that fact.
Yeah.
So what I think that we should do is not to pretend that we don't have that bias, is to acknowledge that we are building narratives and
Yeah.
be aware, be mindful of that.
See, that's super interesting with Malazan, especially because of how we have both the Malazan Book of the Fallen and the novels of the Malazan Empire. It's like you read one of them, you read only one of them, and you're not in possession of all the facts. And like when you then go back and read the other series of books, suddenly events from the first one take on a whole nother meaning. And I mean, you're still not in possession of all the facts because basically no one is actually because because there's two different authors, and I'm almost certain that both Erikson and Esslemont have different recollections of certain events. They're like each in possession of their version of the facts, and they have their perspective. But it's interesting that as a reader, because of that, I don't want to say unique because it's not unique. You have these shared world ideas before and with others, authors and settings, but because of the way that you have two different authors writing in the same world, in a world that they kind of created together, we as readers, by reading different novels and different in a different order, I guess, can kind of feel out or experience this idea of having different perspectives on the same world and same events in the same way that Erikson and Esslemont can, because they were there when it happened, but they still have different views of the matter. So reading that whole thing can teach you a lot about how to read history as well, because this is just sort of in miniature what we do when we do actually study history and read different historiographical narrations of the same event.
And you can put very specific examples for this. Take Lacine.
Yeah.
The treatment of Lacine in the Book of the Fallen versus the novels of the Empire is very different.
Exactly.
I mean, I'm amazed by the fact that the character reads very reasonable. I mean, it retains her identity among the two novels.
True.
But they both give her a very different focus of that. They approach her from very different perspectives.
Yeah, like Esslemont is way more sympathetic towards Lacine.
Yeah,
you read like if you don't read Path to Ascendancy, but if you only read the novels of the Malazan Empire, at the end you're like, shit, I feel bad for her.
Exactly. and he tries to suggest that to the reader very let's say very in a very natural way. I mean, the last chapter of Return of the Crimson Guard starts with an epigraph that is very upfront.
Yeah.
We feel uncomfortable about Lacine because we don't understand her.
Yeah.
It can be summarized in that.
Yeah.
We feel like that about Lacine because we don't understand her. We never did. It's a historian that is describing that.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
I don't understand Shadow Throne either, but
no, that's right. And that's but then we arrive some of the fans, but not some, a lot of the fans actually don't like the way in which a certain character get his name in the Path to Ascendancy, for instance.
Yeah.
And what I will argue is that that's precisely the point, because what you read in the Book of the Fallen, it's supposed to be legendary. It's supposed to be embellished.
Yeah.
This character has an aura of, I mean, he's a legend.
Yeah.
He's worshipped by his fellow soldiers. He's essentially, after Dasimulter, he's the commander. It's Whiskey Jack.
Yeah, I know.
And then when you go back and watch how he got the name, people don't like to put down their their legends, to read the source of the legends, to see the actual origin of these characters. But my point is, well, yeah, that's the point. That's the point they're trying to make, actually. That's it.
Yeah, and I mean, I have like when you just read the Malazan Book of the Fallen, I actually did like a video about that when I was also talking about Ray, because like when you in just the Malazan Book of the Fallen, especially like in Gardens of the Moon and Memories of Ice, those two characters feel very unsatisfying to me because we just have to assume that they're big, like they are legendary already, because we don't have that. And like when you switch to reading this as history or like as historiography, you're like, yeah, of course he's a legendary commander. We just assume that. It's like we read, I don't know, historiography about Rome or whatever. We read Herodotus and we hear about King Leonidas. We are not pissed off that he comes across as this super like strong hero king of Sparta, or like same with Croesus. Croesus is even probably even a better like version of that. But you read that, you just assume, yeah, he is that. We don't need a complete
Account of
biography,
this.
and like it's like how did he end up there? What did he do as a boy? I mean, it's what you kind of get in when you watch the 300 movie or read the accompanying comic, because suddenly we're in like the more like narrative field, and suddenly we want origin stories, or at least Hollywood and Disney think that we want origin stories, and we as readers like, yeah, it's very difficult in a story to just accept that a hero, like most of his like story of becoming the person he is outside of what we know. Now we get that within Path to Ascendancy, and then we realize that this doesn't match with what we finally built up in our minds for ourselves, because we didn't get that the first time around. But if you read it as history, we're like, yeah, well, he's a legendary commander. He's done all these wars that I don't know much about because I have not read that book, like that history book before. I'll just take it as read. And if you just, so I feel that helps to look at it as historiography in that case, to yeah, accept that some people have had a lot of history before that we don't know about.
Absolutely. And also the fact that the thing about the Book of the Fallen in particular, because I have not noticed that yet on the novels of the Empire.
Mm-hmm.
The thing with the Book of the Fallen is that the Book of the Fallen is constantly poking fun at that fact.
Yeah.
You have, for instance, in Memories of Ice, they talk about well, before Memories of Ice, you have been told that there have been this many Jaghut wars
Yeah.
waged by the Aimas as vengeance for what the Jaghut did to them. And these wars are described as this massive events.
Yeah.
And then you go to the prologue of Memories of Ice, and
Yeah.
the 22nd Jaghut War is one Jaghut female adult, two kids, and what is it, 20, 25 Aimas? And that was the 22nd War.
Yeah.
Something that you wouldn't call even a battle in modern terms.
Yeah, but these things just get inflated over time. But so that's interesting to look at, because I don't know how far have you read all of the novels of the Malazan Empire or not? So I don't want to spoil you.
I'm reading Stonewielder, but the thing is that
Okay.
I already know what happens in every novel. I know the synopsis of all the novels, and also
Okay.
Path to Ascendancy.
Okay.
I'm
Okay.
reading it to
Confirm that
because
people gave you the correct synopsis.
no, it's not just that. It's that there's a difference between reading what happened
Mhm.
and living what happened.
Yeah.
Summaries
Um,
are summaries don't replace books.
True.
So
Very true indeed.
I kind of mapped what pieces of information there were in each
Mhm.
book, in each series,
Yeah.
and now I'm doing a full read. And the thing is that I regularly discover things that a summary cannot tell you, because there are things that are so
Mm.
subtly expressed that they don't fit in a
Mm.
summary. They just can't.
Yeah.
So go
So
away, spoil away.
it's all right. So now my point was sort of that in general, and I'm going back to that meta history thing from Hayden White, is basically that once you realize that historiography, uses similar like things that like other like that literature in general does, You can look at different like big works of historiography, because that's basically what White does there. It's like you look at those and you can put them into a specific genre. And for example, White goes and says like Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire is in an ironic mode, a very like it's a farce basically, which it is, because like Gibbon uses a lot of like irony in there. He's like the master of the insulting footnote, if there ever was one. Like seriously, it's I don't know if you have ever read anything by Gibbon, but that one
No,
book
not yet.
on the rise of Christianity is, you read that this could still insult people like 300 years later. This will still insult Christians, which is quite an achievement in itself. But so the point is that you can look at like historiography and see, yeah, this is more like a tragic mode. This is a comedic mode. This is, you can do that with historiography as well. And when you do that, you can see that the overall tone of the novels of the Malazan Empire is a much more serious tone. It's a much more tragic tone in a way. You can look at, especially when you look at the arc of Lacine, you can definitely see how that is more of a tragic like storyline, and it has a more serious tone, both, and it doesn't poke fun at stuff. Whereas the Malazan Book of the Fallen has a much more ironic, distanced look at things and pokes fun at itself in a way that, so those are just the same way that you have like different, that history is written in different tones, basically by different people.
And some other example, for instance, and I imagine that the story behind this must be really fun.
Mm-hmm.
There's all the discussion around Taist Andi and the Taist Liosan.
Yeah.
Esslemont gives a much more fair treatment to the Liosan than Erikson, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
It's like Erikson is the Andi guy and Esslemont is the Liosan guy.
Yeah.
And you can see that this specifically with the way in which they write Osirk.
Yeah.
Osirk in the Book of the Fallen comes off as an asshole.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a fair assessment.
and it makes sense, because whatever happened just before the release of the Crippled God had the Liosan on the opposing side.
Mm.
So the Crippled God has a vested interest in portraying these events in such a way as the opposing side being assholes.
Yeah.
Esslemont, on the other hand, portrays Osirk in a very different way. He's much more noble. And at this point, I can't say for sure, but I get this notion that he paints Dracanus and Anomander as the assholes in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
And when you get this kind of contrast, it's like, what's the truth? Who is saying who has the most precise portrayal of this fictional character?
I feel that kind of goes back to the actual, like, the gaming origins, because one of the two played the character and one of the two had to live through that. It's like the same way with Shadow Throne, like with Esslemont playing Shadow Throne apparently, and Erikson trying to figure out what the hell is going on.
I mean, Anomander is one of the first characters of Erikson. Yeah. He has mentioned that a lot. So of course he's going to treat Anomander like that, because it was him for who knows how many hours.
Yes, and he has a much clearer insight into Anomander's motivations and his character, because he knows all the stuff that he like made up in his head when playing the character that never was played out. So he has additional information that only Stephen Erikson has in his head, probably not even in like a notebook. And that makes it much easier for him to portray that character in a sympathetic way than for Esslemont, who had to suffer through all of the pompous, slow walking of Anomander Rake.
Slow walking,
You
just
know,
like Griffin said.
yeah, exactly. You know, so
And
that's I guess the point there is like they have like different access to the same character because they have different perspectives even on that.
and one of the things I find really peculiar about all
Yeah.
this,
Mm-hmm.
back in the day when we had almost no interviews of Erikson or Esslemont,
Yeah.
there was a request for questions to
Mm-hmm.
present. Um, I don't remember now where it was, but I made an observation to in the form of a question, and they managed to ask him. I think it wasn't the first Apocalypse Forum. I think it was Madness
Mm-hmm.
that made the question. So my observation is this: Shadow Throne is described as being old, from Dalhon,
Mm-hmm.
and wearing a can. So he has problems walking.
Yeah.
You can't characterize that as him being crippled in some form.
Yeah.
So Shadow Throne is, in a way, a crippled god.
Yeah.
Or at least that's his persona, his illusion.
Yeah.
So my question was precisely that: is there a connection between the crippled god, Kaminsod, and the Shadow Throne, the crippled god? And you know what Erikson said?
Mm-hmm.
Look, I'm obviously paraphrasing. Look,
Yeah.
Shadow Throne, that's Cam. All the stuff you read about Shadow Throne, that was Cam messing up with me, coming
Yeah.
up with stuff, and I was all the time. I was okay. Is he a genius, or is he insane?
Yep.
And he says he could never decipher which one it was, and
Yeah.
that's super interesting because we do have interviews with Cam. I don't
Yeah.
think he's ever going to say which one it is.
Well, it will be very difficult. Shadow Throne would obviously say he's a genius, but but you know, the other thing that is interesting about like these portrayals of characters that they played is that when Erikson writes about Anomander Rake, he writes Anomander Rake as he saw him in his mind, as he thought he would play him.
Yep.
Whereas on the other hand, Esslemont writes Anomander Rake as he perceived him being played by Stephen Erikson.
Exactly.
So the question is, which one is the more realistic depiction of Anomander Rake?
That's complicated because
how much self-delusion is in Stephen Erikson's description of Anomander Rake?
Yeah, it has been told by both of them. No, mostly by Erikson. Erikson takes almost no notes of anything.
Yeah.
He writes mostly from memory.
Yeah.
Esslemont apparently has a very good, solid note systems, not only for his novels, but also it seems he has the notes from the RPG
notes.
times.
Yeah. Okay.
So I will think that what Cam says is the closest to what happened.
Yeah.
But in the end, the RPGs are sort of an inspiration in any case.
Yeah.
So
I just meant because when it comes to that kind of thing like Shadow Throne or Anomander Rake, that it's more about the character portrayal and how people perceive that personality played on the table. It's like it's not exactly about what they specifically did or something like that, but it's more like
the perception and
the perception. Exactly. You sit there and you Cam Esslemont sits there and has Stephen Erikson being pompous at him for hours, and then he writes it that way. Whereas in his own mind, Stephen Erikson is like, I played this super tragic person because he's been like around for 300,000 years and has to shoulder all these things, and he's struggling with actually appearing to be human or like human and have like emotions and
Yeah.
stuff. And one of them thinks he has done a great job of portraying that, and the other one is like, oh God, he's
What's
so
he
boring. And so, like, and it goes the other way around. It's like Esslemont is sitting there and is portraying whichever character, like Osirk, as like this noble, heroic person, and Punk
And Erikson is like,
Erikson on the other side is like, I hate authority.
But I mean, what I like about this is that it recreates this parallel, this discrepancies you find in different historical accounts. It recreates them very naturally.
Yeah.
Because you see, you consider Esslemont and Erikson two historical sources.
Yeah.
And the discrepancies, they emerge naturally from what they recollected from those times. And in that respect, I think that what you propose is very useful. Let's say, to analyze Malazan with the characteristics of it being a historiography.
Yeah.
It shares some of the similarities in that respect. Aside from that, from those discrepancies, what I find interesting too is, have you read Carcanas?
I have not read Carcanas yet because of my George R. R. Martin, Patrick Rothfuss trauma.
That's fine. I understand that. I'm also waiting for a Winds of Winter.
I've given up on that line. I recently asked that question: is like, how many monkeys and how many typewriters do we need to get Winds of Winter before George R. R. Martin actually publishes it? And can we get a GoFundMe for that?
I would engage in that GoFundMe because I don't think he's finishing the series, but I think he's finishing Winds of Winter.
We'll see.
So I think he can do it.
And so I'm gonna go and start reading Carcanas after I'm through with my current read through of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, because Walk in Shadow is going to be there like next year or whenever, like more next year than whenever is what I'm trying to say there.
This is not a spoiler because this is covered in the preface. The Carcanas trilogy is basically the poet Old Gallan narrating the tale of wise Carcanas to Fisher Kelta.
Oh, nice.
It is even more overtly metafictional than the Book of the Fallen. But what I find interesting is how here is a bifurcation. Here is Erikson writing a separate canon from his already dubious Book of the Fallen canon.
Yeah.
Because what goes on in Carcanas, Gallan is very transparent about that. He essentially says, look, Fisher, I'm not that passionate about Anomander, so I'm not going to talk about him all that much because I don't think he's so interesting.
Yeah.
This happened a long time ago. So whatever I don't remember or I don't know, I shall invent. And that's basically the synopsis of the preface.
See, that's super interesting. I don't know. Have you ever read the Thucydides Peloponnesian War?
I have not.
Okay. So because at the start of it, it's very interesting. Okay. Quick aside. For a long time, until like very recently, Thucydides was seen as the model historian because he's so accurate in all the stuff that he does, which he's not. Because so the thing is that he claims that he has sorted all sources and figured out what actually happened and written down the truth, except for the speeches and stuff in there which he made up because which he made made up to, have the spirit of the thing that was said back then. And he claims that he has made up those parts, which is the Galan bit that I just, connected to. But the interesting thing there is that he just never gives any sources. He just says, like, I've done that work. This is the final truth on it.
It's like, trust me, I did it. I don't have evidence that I did it, but trust me, I did it.
Exactly. I mean, he probably wasn't too far off, because otherwise we would have a lot of sources of from the same time, or people who actually remember that he was, faking it. But he only puts on like, this is the final, narrative. Whereas when you look at the other big historian of the time, like shortly before that, Herodotus is more like, yeah, I talked to like 5 people. They gave me these 5 versions. Sometimes he's like, I know which one I believe is the correct one, but I'll leave it up to you. And sometimes he just doesn't even do that. It's like, yeah, I spoke to 5 priests. They gave me these 5 versions. Figure out what you think is the best one. So he's much closer to what we do in history nowadays, which is like you actually give your sources and you maybe don't judge. But for a long time, the other way was more about it. But as I said, I was more like connecting to this, like, yeah, this is sort of the truth that I remember, and this is the part that I just made up.
Well, that actually makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
I can see how Erikson took some kind of inspiration from that to start Carcanas like this.
Yeah.
But again, this adds to what I was mentioning earlier, that you have essentially different canons of a shared fictional universe. Of course, Carcanas is way before the role-playing happened, I guess. But
yeah,
the thing is that Carcanas gives you a version of things that eventually happen in the Book of the Fallen.
Yeah.
So you have many canons at play. I call it the Malazan cycle to speak about all the works together.
Yeah.
It gives you a particularly useful framework.
But I mean, that's basically how you do that, right? When you look at it as history, you have the actual history of the Malazan world, which is like stuff happening in the Malazan world, and then you have all these different sources, these different narratives, different historiographies of these events, and then you, as a reader, you read all of those, and depending how many of those you read, you have a different image of it, and you interpolate all of those, to use a more scientific word, right? You take these different sources, and in your own mind, as a reader, you have your own image and your own story of how all the stuff happens in the Malazan world, and that's your interpolation of all the sources that you had. And those are different from the sources that, like mine, are different from the sources that you have, because I've read all the novels of the Malazan Empire and Path to Ascendancy, but you have read Carcanas and I haven't. And then those are still our like reader versions are still like interpretations of different from like Esslemont's version and Erikson's version, because they have like either notes or no notes, or their memories, and still like also their perspectives of living through some of that stuff by experiencing it at the table. So we're coming close to that as a parallel to real world history, because we don't have like real world history. We have like all these perspectives.
Yeah, we kind of look at history like this abstract something that we can approach but never reach. It's like an asymptotic approach to something that it's unreachable.
Yeah, it's like in mathematics, right? It's like the more data points you have, the closer your interpolation comes to the actual real curve. But it
converges to something, but it never reaches the something. It never becomes the something.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's. I like to think on those terms. Yeah.
I thought you might appreciate me using an actual scientific metaphor there.
Absolutely. I don't know if that makes me a list maker, but I'll take the chances.
I hate lists, but I did, study computer science and had to take math classes for that, especially numerics. So I did a lot of interpolation and stuff like that.
I like lists, but I also like being aware of their limited nature. Mm-hmm. So it's a mix of both.
As a computer scientist, I can tell you lists are far superior to arrays, but that's just a different discussion.
My experience with Liz has been mostly on Python. Yeah, they're the best, honestly.
Well, mine has been mostly on Haskell, but I mean, Python is just a more usable version of it, I guess.
Much friendlier. Yeah. So
Well, a quick aside to that. I don't know. Maybe we should actually find like a place to actually end this for now because I'm running out of beer.
absolutely. That's fine. Great. Still have some beer here, but that's fine.
Also, we're drifting off into computer science talks.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll come back to that for a different talk.
Absolutely. And
the mechanics of the Malazan world.
I'm open to collabs. It's been really fun to discuss this kind of topics. What I often mention people, you know, I've seen your channel has been posted on the Malazan Reddit.
Yeah.
And what I also
still need to figure out who did that because they say they're like in my university, and I'm like, who is that? And I need to go through my list of friends to figure out who that is.
Figure that out because he says that he was running the cafeteria at uni, and that you were always there, like talking about super interesting stuff. What I mentioned in those comments is the fact that, look, people here on Reddit love the way I discuss the series. Not all of them, of course, but many of them love that. What I can say is that I have a very particular perspective given my background. Raf is the kind of guy that has a background in everything that I ignore. So go check that guy because he brings up amazing stuff that I just don't have the background about. So I think that this kind of collabs are awesome because it gives the combination of the two perspectives gives a lot of information about well, not just about Malazan, but about all the topics that interconnect with Malazan, and I think that's really fun.
I mean, that's on the other hand, that's like the big thing about Malazan is that as a series, it has so many points where you can connect all kinds of other stuff onto. It's a very very connective kind of thing. And that's something I really appreciate about it.
Yep, it's one of the best aspects of the series. It allows you to, what can I say, to use your passion, your interest to contextualize the series and discuss it further down the line in different ways. Can approach it from history, from philosophy. I mean, I understand professional philosophers don't see that as actual philosophy, but if you're doing a more lenient take on philosophy, it's really thought-provoking from a political perspective. If you're into military tactics and combat, that's great too. You can look at it from a literary perspective. It actually allows for a very flexible, let's say, interpretation. So that's always awesome about this series.
Yeah, that's what makes great literature, that it's connects to so many people, to so many things, and is so accessible from all different like walks of life.